bit here for a second. I've known Leanne for at least, and don't worry, Mark, it's all I'm gonna be appropriate. I've known Leanne for oh gosh, at least 20 years. We've done a lot of work together in the past around abuse and violence against people with disabilities. I have such admiration and respect for her. Many great stories, some of which I cannot share publicly. But she's an amazing person with a long background in this area, and I'm so grateful that she's here today to share this with us. Leanne, take it away, my friend. No further introduction is needed because I think that everybody is just waiting to hear from you and the amazing work that you're doing. So, go ahead, Leanne.
Thank you, Teresa. I need to say the same thing about Teresa because working at the National Organization of the Ark for now, I just celebrated 30 years last week. Um, you find those champions in these fields, in these specific areas, like around criminal justice or healthcare, what have you. And certainly, Teresa, you have been one of those people for me. I'm just so appreciative when we can find like-minded folks that are doing this work. And of course, in or outside of the arc, this is why things like silence equals violence is so important because we find ways to connect um, to really address larger systemic issues. And that's what I know that this group is about. And I have been here before. And I always say I'm happy to come back and provide any updates at any time because I really believe in the mission of Silence Equals Violence. And I'm thrilled about the work that you all are doing together. So I know it seems like even just maybe getting together every now and then, like, you may wonder, what is that going to do? Well, you'd be surprised what that can do. And it really does take such little effort to come together and just share updates like what Jill just shared. I mean, those are things that can spark ideas and movement throughout your state. So kudos to all of you for continuing to do this important work and how it can impact the entire state where you are. And I've got to say that I love all of the California backgrounds. I wish that I could do that. I'm in Texas, so I don't have as pretty of backgrounds as you all do. But the ARC, when I was hired, they used to be here in Arlington, Texas. So that's how I originally came to the ARC. But loving the whole California vibe. So thank you for that.
We know how
Um,
to roll here in
you
California.
know how to roll, I know. I remember one of my first times to the California and was shocked at the beauty. And I was just like, wow, why do I live in Texas? That was my question. Haven't figured out how to move yet, but you never know. I could end up somewhere else. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Hold on a second. I've got too many things open as usual. Thank you for the laugh. Now, if you ever want to come to Texas, I've got some rooms here, so come on down. We are very friendly and we like to host people, so there's that.
I can confirm that.
Okay, so let's start with the slideshow. Feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions. If this will work. There we go. I do feel like my computer is a little slow today, so. How many of you, I know you're probably all familiar with the ARC, but we have what's called a National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. I know some of you on here are familiar with that, but I'll give you a little bit of history of the center. And then I'd like to just share with you some updates of our projects that we've been working on and how the healthcare and equity around healthcare kind of intersects with justice as well, not only for victims, but also where we need training for law enforcement. So, the mission of the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability is to advocate at that intersection of disability advocacy and reforming our criminal justice system, because I think we all agree that it could use some reform. So when did the center start? We've been around since 2013. We were supported through the Bureau of Justice Assistance to create training and the center. And a goal of this center is to look at all sides of this issue. We know that people with IDD are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, both as victims and as those in our prisons and jails. And so it's very important that we take the whole 360 view and think about how people with disabilities can be both throughout the system. We have a broad portfolio of projects that I'll talk about in a minute, and our target audiences are disability advocates, those in the criminal justice professions, people with IDD, and our network. We provide training and technical assistance, information referral nationwide. So if you have an issue come up, please reach out to us. We are here to provide support in any way we can. Sometimes we can find local agencies that can support in specific cases, but sometimes there isn't anyone. So we try to step up and provide that support in those situations. We also have a resource collection of different fact sheets, publications, and I'll talk some about our Pathways to Justice and our new Just Policing training. And of course, we try to get the word out as much as possible. So I love that the ARC of California, we get to work with you all when you're putting out different key items. Lately, there's been quite a bit around ICE and those issues. So figuring out, how we can share those channels and making sure that in meetings like these, we're working together to get out key messages. We've had many different project partners over these years since the center started. I think this speaks to the need to not stay in the disability bubble. A lot of what we've done at around criminal justice issues is really try to make deep inroads and connections to justice-related organizations, and in our health projects to health-related organizations. And while, of course, we need to be working together within disability, we have limited time, right, to kind of meet our goals and to envision the future together. And sometimes we kind of get stuck in our own little bubbles. There's silos around these issues, and the whole goal around the center is to really break through those and try to find ways to think of creatively how we could be collaborating together. So these are some of our great partners that we've worked with or that we currently work with. So I wanted to highlight the three kind of current projects that relate to what you all are doing. And I'll talk about transforming healthcare and our language access barriers project, and then just policing. So starting with transforming healthcare, I don't need to tell you all that the rate of sexual violence is alarming. Many of you are here because you understand the data around how often people with IDD experience sexual violence. And I was so excited to hear how many of you are new to this meeting. So that's really great. The data that we do have on this shows that people with intellectual disability specifically are 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault than those without disabilities. And from the National Crime Victim Survey, we know that if you look at different types of disabilities, it's those with cognitive disabilities that face the highest rates of violent victimization. There's many reasons that we need to be focusing on this, but there's several barriers to justice, and some of the projects I'll talk about today are addressing those barriers. I wanted to bring up a point that I'm sure all of you probably know Keisha Weller, who is co-founder of this Silence Equals Violence Network, and also a colleague and a friend. We've been working together many years now. Amazing advocate who has some just amazing insights in terms of bringing her own story forth and being able to, I think, be so transparent and honest about her own life and her own kind of struggles around the issues, and the way that she's been able to be such a great advocate for peer support in this area. One of the things that just really got me about these quotes is thinking about how the trauma itself is one thing, But then when there's no support after, that's a whole nother level of trauma that the survivor has to deal with. And she said here for victims with disabilities, the help is often too little, too late. So we want to keep at the forefront of this meeting and everything we do the reminder that this is about people's lives that are being affected every single day. And often we may not see it because a lot of this happens, of course, behind closed doors. It may not even come to the light of day for many people. But to remember stories like Keisha's and understand that just how often sexual violence is happening, I think it really kind of keeps us highly motivated to find ways to work together to continue to look at not only how do we educate those in healthcare, but also in justice and in other professions. Now, Keisha was also helped lead this project called Talk About Sexual Violence. And I'm going to mention this one because this was a 7-year project funded by With Foundation to help us figure out how do we help healthcare providers feel more comfortable to even talk about this issue. And how do people with disabilities feel more comfortable to talk to their providers about this? And so we created some short videos that are available at talkaboutsexualviolence.org that continue to get quite a bit of views to help the disability community and the medical community know how to address some really hard personal issues around violence. And in that, for our Transforming Healthcare project, let me skip over to that one real quick. The mission of our Transforming Healthcare project is to advance equity in healthcare by promoting the leadership and lived experiences of people with IDD when training healthcare professionals. But not only to provide that pathway to enable people with IDD to be leaders in this area, but to also do that while focusing on more information about sexual violence. So what we did is we took our project about talk about sexual violence and all of the work that we did in that project and everything we learned around increasing that we need to increase patient-centered conversations, increasing reporting of sexual violence, and decreasing that discomfort. We wanted to bring all of that information into the new Transforming Healthcare project that would not only address sexual violence, but now have a new way of educating students, medical students, about this topic. And what's great is that we're kind of stacking knowledge upon knowledge and finding ways to work with new partners as well in that, which I will bring up in a minute when Dawn speaks, because we are now working with the World Institute on Disability with this project as well. So just some of the things that we learned through the Talk About Sexual Violence project are some key accommodations for victims with disabilities. And while we're also looking at systemic change, we need to remember that providing the very practical everyday tools is essential in any work that we do. And so this is kind of an example of what we would share with healthcare providers, making sure that we are connecting, like thinking about how do we connect local healthcare with the disability community? And how do we make sure that they understand what are some key accommodations for victims? So for this Transforming Healthcare project, we are partnering with 3 of our chapters. One of those is the ARC of Massachusetts, which has a very popular training for medical students called Operation House Call. So what this program does is it teaches medical students about people with autism and other IDDs. It has classes for those students taught by parents and people with IDD so they can co-teach these classes. They then have home visits with families and people with IDD, and then the debrief for medical students afterwards. And the point of this was to really try and make this more about building personal understanding and relationships with the disability community. So instead of just taking a class, you're actually able to visit with people with disabilities in places where they feel comfortable. And you get to learn more about everyday life of people with disabilities and their families. And this has actually been a pretty popular program in Massachusetts. They've even passed legislation to help fund this type of training because of Operation House Call in their state. So we're partnering in our Transforming Healthcare project with this chapter and two other chapters to look at how are they currently educating healthcare providers, specifically through medical schools, medical students, but also in other ways, so that we can look at what's working, think about how they're including people with disabilities themselves in leadership positions to do this, and then how they can include sexual violence specifically in their training, which currently is not happening. And then through that, we will be looking at how do we shift healthcare culture through having honest conversations between both communities, and how do we address those significant healthcare challenges that can happen because of the bias that we all know exists in healthcare and because of that lack of cultural understanding in general about disability community. And through all of that work, through different focus groups that we did to even prepare for this project, we will be creating guidelines that will emphasize the findings from speaking with our advisory board. That will be in the next slide, and speaking with our chapters and learning from them and their kind of practical takeaways in what they've done so far, what could be improved. And we're working with WID, the World Institute on Disability, to help us with that evaluation with our chapters and with the information that we find out through our advisory board. And what's great is we can leverage all of the work that we've done through Talk About Sexual Violence as we bring kind of both of those projects together. So these are our overall objectives. We will be and have been training healthcare providers. So taking that existing training that's already been happening, and three chapters are providing that training. They're providing data to us about the trainings. And the goal is to train 3,000 plus healthcare providers and collect that data to evaluate the impact of those trainings. We're also building the collaborative networks through the Disability-Led Advisory Board. And thanks to WID for working with us on this to create a web page for the advisory board members that really provide all of the information that we talk about in our meetings. It provides supports that you might need before going into a meeting. We are very careful. In fact, we had a meeting today, painstakingly so, to think through how is everybody included? How do we ensure that people who are leading meetings feel the most prepared to do so? How do we make sure that the way that they do that also is helpful for people who may not have disabilities? We think of it all. And we realize that to truly be inclusive in spaces like this between healthcare and the disability community, it takes a lot of thought. But once you have done that, the kind of aha moments of, wow, this is really, it's like we're really connecting. We're really getting to some answers here that we know can have the ability to shift how people see in the healthcare community, see people with disabilities or vice versa. And so when we get to see that happening in these board meetings, it's really so gratifying to know that there are healthcare providers that want these changes, right? There are people with disabilities that are, I mean, they've been begging for these changes, and they are able to bring out and say from a very honest place, this is what we need and this is why we need it. Our next meeting is actually going to be on sexual violence, and we are so excited to get to hear from people with disabilities themselves about what they need from healthcare providers. And so we're happy, of course, with Dawn being here and Mark, we're happy to share, keep sharing with you kind of the output and the findings that we have from the project. So that's transforming healthcare. And I tend to talk too much. So just let me know if I'm going on too long. And Teresa, you'll have to be my timekeeper.
You're doing good. If you you're on till about 2, but if you want to give room for any Q&A, you adjust how you feel best.
Okay, great. Thank you. So another project that is pretty much over at this point, but we're looking for more funding right now, and the report is due this month, is called the Language Access Barriers to Reporting Project. And we know that people with disabilities are less likely to report crime. And the reason behind this, the purpose behind this project was to try to think about who is the person least likely able to report crime. And of course, we know that those who are non-speaking have less access to be able to do that. And this was really what drove the creation of this project. And one of the things that we point out as a project team is this particular data point that looks at how many people are less likely to report. And when you look at different types of disabilities on this chart, you will see that those with cognitive disabilities have the highest rate of those less likely to report, 59.98%. So, with that in mind, this project was created, funded by the U.S. Department of Justice OVW, or Office of Violence Against Women, led by the University of Cincinnati. And the purpose of the project was to conduct comprehensive assessments of what the language access barriers are, hearing from people themselves that have disabilities, so that they can be fully heard in this process and they can fully participate, which, as we know, that's what the ADA says they should be able to do. Um, but, we have a law around that. And of course, while we have that, we know that there's still quite a bit of misunderstandings and biases that can happen, and why it's important for projects like this to exist. This is just a shout out to the project team. So Dr. Brittany Hayes really led the effort around this with Dr. Powers, Cooper, myself, Amanda, and Jacqueline. Amanda is a speech language pathologist with the university. Dr. Hayes is a parent and also a researcher. And I just feel so honored to be part of this team because I am not a researcher, but I love being a part of the research because I understand how important it is that we base what we do on, as much as we can, right? Evidence-based practices. And so working with the research community and academia will give us the kind of foundation we need to make that systemic change happen. And so working with them, which I haven't really at the center had a lot of opportunity to do this closely, I think will help us kind of take that next step. Not only, and of course, you need funding to do this work, but to really kind of improve the credibility, right? That we have hard data to show we know how much this is happening, or we know this is the kind of tool that we need to use. And that's what this project is about. So the project goal was to enhance the access to justice for victims with IDD and making sure that everyone can tell their truth. And we did that through 3 key ways. One was a systematic review of the research. Secondly, a policy analysis looking at the websites of police departments, victim service agencies as well, and looking at where they mention disability. Did they mention disability? How did they mention disability? To kind of get an idea of that. And then also mandatory reporting guidelines were looked at through APS across all 50 states. And the way that we got this information is through interviews and focus groups. We had a total of 175 individual participants, including those with IDD, parents and caretakers, and practitioners. Just some of the findings you can see here kind of show how many agencies were involved. We looked at 4 different states, and Ohio, Florida, New Jersey, and Arizona. So overall, what we found is that if disability was mentioned, it wasn't mentioned in the way we would hope, in that they're saying, here's a protocol, or here's how we here's a protocol we might use to make sure that we're providing accommodations for people with disabilities, or here's how we um, include people with disabilities in our use of force policy, right? This is kind of what we were looking at. How much is it even on the radar, in the policies around these areas? And so this just showed that when it was brought up, it was usually in their EEO kind of statement. You'll see that in the upper right. Or it was named because they had a database. And so they were saying that in our database, the system includes a picture, disability, description. So descriptive purposes, not because this was for people with disabilities. And I think that's while we kind of know that in our, we kind of know that that's not happening and it's not necessarily in websites, it's important to document this. This is where we can have more power and say in showing, like, when you have the data, you can be much more influential in saying, this is missing, this is what we need to be including, and this is why. Now, through the different one-on-one interviews or focus groups, we heard different themes in the beginning of the project from law enforcement and survivors. So, for example, law enforcement, we're talking about thinking that it was a slow and more slow process. They were talking about language. Some of them had good ideas. Like, for example, the one below on language, they would use first, then language so that people would know first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this next. So there were some good ideas from law enforcement. But then we saw that some just didn't really know how to interact or how to communicate with people with disabilities. And then on the survivor side, they definitely had issues around navigating the quote process around being able to report. So one of them said, for example, that they needed choices. They needed step by step. They needed to know beforehand what would happen if they were to report. And one of the things that we're looking at and how we're using this information is to think about, okay, what tools do people need? And one of the things that we are thinking about is perhaps an app. And that's what we're looking at for funding at the next step is providing an app, other ways, maybe using technology that we can help crime victims, specifically those who are non-speaking, to be able to report this type of victimization. So our conclusions were that both highlight gaps, but there is disconnect between law enforcement and survivors on how to address them. They have different ideas on that, as you can imagine, that appropriate accommodations need to be institutionalized, trained, and transparent for victims and supports. So while there may be accommodations here and there, they are not generally what's happening when a crime victim wants to report. Our next steps will be to continue looking for funding. This was actually earlier when we were still in the project. Lots of coding went on to try to find out what are the themes around the different ideas that people were bringing forward. And again, our main goal is to develop tools for the disability community that are driven by the disability community. And I do want to mention that shout out to Keisha Weller, who was willing to work with us on this project too. And we thinking about ways that we can provide information using plain language, which she helped us do. And I was actually checking these QR codes earlier. I think the one on the left works. I don't think the one on the right works anymore. But you can check that out with your phone. And then also we have this project website. We've actually had 3 or 4 articles published in academic journals through this project so far. And what's so exciting is that it's a true kind of partnership for all of us where the researchers have invited myself, people with disabilities, to be co-authors in this work. So that's been really exciting. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention just policing. I had already said that we know we have overrepresentation of people in our prisons and jails that have cognitive disabilities. 2 in 10 prisoners and 3 in 10 jail inmates report having a cognitive disability. We know that we need more training. I want to highlight the story of Eric Parsa here. who's hugging his mom in this picture, who was killed by police due to police being called when he was having a meltdown in where they live in New Orleans. And even though the parents were there, even though the parents were saying he can't breathe, the officers continued on with holding him down. And within a few minutes, he had died right there. And it was very tragic. If you knew this family like I do now, you would know that they did everything possible for their only son. Um, and because of that, they are really trying to use their story to help educate others about how important it is that we train as many as possible. They have great relationships with their local police, but this happened in the county over. And how do we know when we can call police if you don't know what you're getting when you call? And I think that's kind of the issue here and why we have to think about consistency when we're training, whether it's healthcare, whether it's police. How do we get that consistent approach in what we do? So I put there was a story done on this on the disability reframe segment. And so I provided that PBS link here if you want to check that out. And so Just Policing was our last project that ended recently, funded through the COPS office, Community Oriented Policing Services through the Department of Justice. And what we wanted to do, because we do have training for police, but that's more built into a whole community where you're training police, attorneys, victim advocates, and where you're creating a disability response team. Whereas this is a training that police can take online and it's basically specifically for them. And for the first time, we were able to look at bringing in not only kind of the typical information that's in this training, but looking at the intersection of, um, say, for example, people in the LGBTQ community, the Black community, very specific issues at that intersection. That was the reason why we created this training. Little did we know that so much in the politics would change after we got this grant, but we were able to finish it. And now we get to say whatever we want to with it because it does not have their label on our product. So I am happy about that. So what is this training looking to do? We want to identify potential characteristics and behaviors of people with IDD, talk about accommodations, we talk about the communication tips, specifically around Mirandizing, interviewing, interrogating, articulate ways to de-escalate situations, of course, and then identify and explain resources specific to the IDD community. This is just an overview of some of the modules. We start off with a general overview of the training itself, provide an introduction to disability and criminal justice issues. How do you define disability? Because many people don't even know there's a difference between, say, a mental illness and an intellectual or developmental disability. We did a deep dive into justice-involved youth, including looking at school resource officers, officers understanding the school to prison pipeline. And then building cultural and trauma-informed competencies is key. That's where we hear, and we do have videos too, that are now available. We hear from communities of color around this issue, very specific concerns, like when your adult son or daughter, or even youth or child has a disability, and you're from a certain culture, and how does that play into what you feel when you see an officer or how an officer might respond to you. Then in Module 6, we look at legal obligations around ADA. And then finally, we bring it all together by really going into cases on how officers interact based on, say, someone has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, different kinds of common occurrences that we may see in the community. And what's exciting is we used a tool to provide ways to have more like engagement when it's an online training. We created 6 different videos, and we're using kind of more forward thinking and advanced ways to engage our audience within the training. So we're very excited to for that to go live later this year. We're still working on getting it certified through a national, it's actually an international policing organization that certifies training so that an officer took that training, they could get credit automatically for that. So we're hoping that that will really help kind of get people to the site for the training. If you'd like to use these videos yourself, please do. You can get access to those now on our website. And as I said, there's 6 different videos, and it's very handy. They're like 2 to 3 minutes to be able to say why training is needed. And you hear that from different perspectives, from an officer who has a child with a disability to the Parsa family that I just mentioned, to we have someone who's been with a university from the Black community who talks specifically about his fears around that. So we tried to really bring in diverse voices around this issue so that we can help officers see that you've got to think about not only a person as one thing, but think about all the different dimensions of a person when you're interacting. So I think I'm going to pause there because Pathways we've had for a while. That's a much more comprehensive training program that kind of looks at more than just the training. It's talking about how do we come together as communities to address criminal justice and disability issues. But I can tell you more about that if you're interested. And then I want to end with kind of a vision for the future, if you will, to create what's called a Disability Justice Advocate Certification Program. So in other countries, for example, in the UK, they have what's called an appropriate adult that will step in and provide that, provide support if someone with a disability is faced with a criminal justice situation and their rights can be protected. They have an advocate there to step in. And we don't have really anything similar to that in the US. And so this has kind of been something that my late mentor, Bob Persky, and I, back in the day when I first came to the ARC, even talked about back then, kind of like CASA, CASA volunteers, or having something like that here in our country to ensure that the rights of people with disabilities are protected. And so we're looking at ways to create a certification program that would provide specific skills and knowledge for advocates who could then hopefully one day we would like to get paid as well for this type of advocacy so that we can ensure that it is sustained over time. So if that's something that interests you and you would like to talk more about that, I just decided, I guess 30 years in, that it's never going to be the perfect time to do like the next thing and just start putting the dream out there and kind of seeing where that goes. But yeah, so I think that's all I have for now. I hope that I hit all the healthcare issues well, Mark, and that everything got addressed. But is there any questions at this point or anything that y'all like to comment on?
Leon, that was amazing. There is so much there. I think we have time for maybe one or two quick questions, and then if I don't know if you have the ability to stick around, but if we have time at the end, we can also do questions then too, in case people have more questions. But real quick before we transition, I just want to say that thanks for bringing up Keisha. I should have brought her up in the very beginning. Keisha is a co-founder of Silence Equals Violence. She's a self-advocate. She is on the planning committee. She wasn't able to be in the meeting today, but that is just something that we cannot ever look past or understate the importance of the self advocates that came together to create this coalition and network. So thank you so much. I think we could do one or two quick questions and then we will move on. But we could answer more questions on the backside of the meeting. If anyone have a quick question.
There was one in the chat, Teresa, too.
Oh, okay. Do you want to read that, Tyler?
It's a long one. Um, but just you might be able to read it too or see it too,
Oh,
Leanne.
is it the one for Martha?
Uh,
I'm starting
No,
at the top. Sorry, I have not been looking at the chat, y'all, because I get too distracted.
And I was
no,
taking notes, so had a
Is
lot of
there a
things to
copy of the
say.
agenda? Oh, I see. No, keep going. Thanks,
I put
Dave.
all the
something
way down. Yeah.
I put something in chat. This is Tanya speaking. Just a question about CIT training, so
Yes,
crisis
yes.
intervention training, which
Yeah.
has sort of created an additional subset around IDD specifically and been entrenched in LD37 trainings or post trainings for police cadets. And a lot of resources have been put into this in several states, California being one of them. And speaking with an advocate recently, they indicated that research shows that it's not particularly effective. So I was curious what your thoughts were on that, considering how much attention and funding goes into that, and if there are alternatives that you think are better, or frankly, what that research is, because I haven't been able to find it.
Wow, great question. I love this question. And I didn't have time to go into that. We've been on a project related to CIT for about 3 years. But so what they did with CIT is the federal government is trying to make it more of an actual curriculum. No, it hasn't had good evaluation base. So in order to do that, they created a project to create what's called crisis response intervention training, which you can go look at right now. It's free. It's on a website. Um, the whole like curriculum is on there. And the idea behind it was to give it more of an actual curriculum that you could evaluate. And then secondly, to bring more about IDD into throughout the curriculum. Because yes, current CIT does have what that 1 hour or 2 hour space. Sometimes it's just says it's on autism. I mean, it depends on the state, the place, the community, right? What they're going to focus on. But for CRIT, we're hoping that that is more embedded into the curriculum itself throughout the training. And we brought more in on IDD. So is that going to solve everything? No. It's a step in the right direction to bring in more on IDD in the current kind of CIT. And now there's another option out there for officers, which you can't make anyone take. But I mean, it's a another option for officers that they can use with CRIT. And then to your other point, there's a couple of researchers that really focus in on CIT and its effectiveness. And they have found it to be effective in a couple of the research studies. They have found it be effective in certain ways, but I wouldn't say that that translates to officers actually changing their behavior. So I think you have to ask, what are we saying when we say it's effective? In what way are we defining that? And I'm not totally convinced that we have all those answers that we want right now. And I love that you bring that up because it's the whole issue around evidence-based practices. And how do we know what works? How do we know which training is working? And all of us that kind of create the training, we have things in place to say, here's what we know from people who take it and what they think about it and things like that. But we definitely need more kind of science behind accommodations, what accommodations work. I was just in a meeting today around that, talking to someone with the Netherlands, and her research and dissertation was all around trying to figure out, what works in the interrogation room, for example. So I think there is some data, but depending on how you're saying it's successful, that's, up in the air. And if you'd like to see those articles, I could forward those to you so you can kind of take a look at those for yourself.
Leanne, you mentioned a couple things that if people were interested in, can you put your email in the chat so people can
Sure, yeah.
contact you with those interests? I know that there are some things I'm sure everybody will be interested in learning more about, but also the questions that you asked if they want to get more information. And also, real quick, and Leanne is an incredible resource. There's a lot. I go to Leanne for a lot in this area. So think of her as a resource as well at the NCCJD and she'll put her information in there. Thank you so much, Leanne, and I hope we have time at the end for more questions. Um, Incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now I have the pleasure to introduce Dawn Skaggs. She's Chief Program Officer with the World Institute on Disability. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Dawn, I think, over the last year and a half, and specifically over the probably close to the last year with the grant and the project she's working on that she's going to share today. Dawn, thank you so much for being here. I really personally enjoy working with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing, to ongoing conversations about uh, disability, healthcare, and inclusion, and how it relates with AI. So, with that, take it away, Dawn.
Thanks, Teresa. It is an absolute pleasure to be joining you, this group today. And I am going to try to speak and use my technology at the same time to show my slides. We'll see how that goes. That will be my first challenge of the event. Do you all see my screen? Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to start by introducing myself and WID, which is the acronym for the World Institute on Disability, and hopefully in the process of that, share with you why we're here and some of the ways that the work we're doing in many facets overlaps and corresponds and supports the work that each and every one of you is doing. As we go through this, one of the things I wanted to share with you right up front is that this is a little bit of a change from Leanne's wonderfully linear walk through specific projects. I'm going to take you on a little bit of an adventure and look ending up at the AI role in the delta between disabilities, particularly IDD, and healthcare. But in order to do that, I'm going to back up to talk about some accessibility components and the big picture of the world that we're working in our little silos. And so if some of the things that we talk about are a little bit of a review for you, feel free to grab a cup of coffee, and I will go through some of the foundations rather quickly so we can spend more time specifically talking about the projects, some of the things we've discovered in the last couple of years, and what that might mean to how we move forward in the next few years. So WID has been so incredibly fortunate to be partnering with the ARC in the last year and a half, almost, on the project that Leanne shared with you, which is the Transforming Healthcare Project. Prior to that, WID is a disability-led organization whose office is actually located in the Ed Roberts campus on UC Berkeley. So like Leanne, I appreciate all of the California backgrounds and the California culture that's here with you today. Our founders, Ed Roberts, Judy Human, and Joan Leone, that you can see a picture of on this slide, are really the founders of the disability movement and also often regarded as the mother and father of the ADA. So we have some great lineage here within this organization. It began as a policy and research think tank, and the activities have always been reliant on collaboration and community engagement. So for 40 years, we've been continuously disability-led, making us the oldest disability-led organization in the country. That is a very strong thread that runs through everything we do, everything we say, and everything we are. We're committed to disability leadership in all facets of the community, and you'll see how that plays out in some of the projects that I'm going to highlight. Although the campus is in California, I have to disclose I do not have the fortune of being there. I come to visit family whenever I can, but I, like Leanne, am geographically located in Texas. But our outlook has been the same, even though our projects have changed and the geographic location of our staff has changed. We are really consistently looking at ensuring that the real needs of lived experience of people with disabilities, it directs and frames the policies, the practices of society, and that includes any areas that may challenge society and challenging some of the established social norms, norms that don't often work well for people with disabilities. I wanted to, before I move on, sort of give you an example of that that's rather pertinent today. We have a global work that works with disability-led organizations in disasters through our Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration, and you'll see the logo down there. We have 2 staff in Vienna as we speak, engaging in an event that where we're receiving an award for that program. And that program is, I mentioned, for a couple different reasons. Disasters and crises and environments around crises, such as shelters, consistently create instances of sexual violence, especially for individuals with disabilities. GADRA does not respond to disasters in the traditional charity model. However, we use a virtual emergency operations center to support and empower the local disability expertise in that situation and in that geography. So in that capacity, we developed an AI tool that assists the local organizations to navigate that complex and often unsafe world of crises and disaster response. So I mentioned that because of the twofold application of that program, both in the additional challenges that occur in crises and in the use of AI, which we're going to end up talking about today. We primarily work in 3 focus areas, which I'll go through very quickly. Global community inclusion, which is really focused on creating a safe and inclusive community where people with IDD and other disabilities can experience opportunities for growth, community engagement, and leadership, and where they can feel safe. The other area is in accessibility and universal design, where we really focus on building and sustaining accessible, physical, virtual spaces and accessible communication within those spaces. We look at accessibility within the community through the lens of universal design as a standard. And when we cannot reach universal design successfully to provide full inclusion and access, then we look at accessibility components and how we layer those on to ensure that everyone has equal access. We do this and this makes us another very typical partner for the ARC. One of the ways we do this is through research. We do a lot of research conducting disability-led UX testing, focus groups, and proctored data gathering to ensure that anything that's done is done from the expertise of people with the lived experience. And the third area that we work is, as I mentioned, emergency preparedness, disaster risk reduction, climate justice, and equitable healthcare. In that area, we create programs and policies that are aimed to protect people with disabilities in circumstances that challenge society's daily mechanisms. We know that in those events, in times of crises, the people who are most vulnerable to being left behind, the people that are most frequently not included in any kind of planning or response activity are people with disabilities. And so that is the focus that we work in from that perspective, focusing on facilitating systems change that improve health, safety, and resilience. In order to do that, we really have 2 target populations. One are the agencies, governments, NGOs, and service providers that really are responsible for executing systems change. And the other is the individuals themselves and disability-led organizations that have the knowledge and the skills to lead that systems change and have to be closest to the power and to the change itself. So that said, we engaged with the ARC on the Transforming Healthcare project. And Leanne did a magnificent job of sharing with you what the project is, what we're doing, and the specific details. what I wanted to touch on that particular project involves the challenge of systemic change to complex challenges like this, creating person-centered healthcare experiences that meet the needs of individuals with IDD who have also experienced sexual violence. It's a multi-level challenge because it involves multiple groups with diverse expertise and a wide variety of resources and capabilities. This project, in doing that, it includes incorporating the knowledge, the expertise, and the lived experience of people with disabilities, individuals who have lived experience. And in this project, I have had the tremendous fortune of also meeting Keisha and getting to know her a little bit. She envelops and exemplifies that component of this project. The second component that we need to address that in all of our work is enabling the healthcare providers to integrate that person-centered planning and the supported decision-making and providing the accommodations in their process and within their practices, not as an added add-on or as a special thing that has happened, but in the way they do business on a daily basis. There is a lot of systems change involved in just that statement. And then the third piece is identifying knowledge and skills that are necessary to create those accessible and inclusive environments. It doesn't just happen because we say it's important and it needs to be done. There is a whole plethora of skills, knowledge, resources, and capabilities that have to come into play in order to achieve those goals. And in this project, we're really breaking those down and looking at what are they and how can they be implemented in a real, tangible, and sustainable way. So in essence, the project is taking a real practical approach to the needs and the abilities of healthcare providers. It is not about affirming what we already know to be right. It's really about how do we make it work for the people in the communities on a daily basis. So in order to understand and address those needs and approach that multifaceted challenge, we need to look at the inclusion of people with IDD in circumstances around sexual violence and experiences in healthcare. And in order to do that, I think we need to look at the context of accessibility in our social environments. And I'm going to get very broad and then we'll pull it right down to something more specific and narrow. As most of you already know, 28% of the people in the US have a disability. And we know that the number is higher than that. That is a percentage of people who self-identify as having a disability. The vast majority of that population, that 28%, are people with non-apparent disabilities. And we also know that everybody across time, across their lifespan, will be impacted by a disability. And if we're fortunate to keep living, our probability of experiencing disability grows exponentially as we get older. That said, this isn't a specific thing we do for a specific group of people. We have to start with the premise that this is for all of us and about all of us and needs to be looked at in how we do everything we do. This makes accessibility not something special, but how we live our daily lives. We can summarize the types of accessibility in 3 areas: physical, communication, and digital. It can also be visible or invisible, and general or specific. Some familiar examples of assistive technology that are used for accessibility are things that you would not normally think of possibly as accessibility issues. One might be your phone. I think most of us are within arm's reach as we speak of a smart device. And those are very increasingly commonly used for accessibility devices, providing phone settings that are personalizable for individuals with audiobooks, volume buttons, font sizes, audio speeds, and all kinds of other things that we have now successfully, by using the phone, integrated into accessibility features into how we live our daily life. This is a model that we need to be looking at moving forward. Some other accommodations are embedded into how we interact. These you will also be familiar with. They are including taking more time, paying attention to what people are saying, repeating what we've heard. All of those things are things that, for most of you on this call, are probably the way you already do business, but not necessarily the way that our general community does business. And integrating that idea into all of our exchanges is a form of constantly educating the community. Our goal should always be universal design. So we create community experiences that welcome and support all members of the community. And after that, as needed, we implement accommodations. When we interact with other members of the community, especially those from healthcare, safety and security, community services, and others, the perception that we receive is often that disability accommodations are difficult, or they're expensive, or they're too much, or my favorite phrase is, it's an unfunded mandate. And so there's often a initial negative pushback. What we know from the data is, in reality, disability accommodations are usually low to no cost and usually have a positive impact on the program or service. So it's just getting over that hump of perception. A good example of that is the curb cuts that you have an image of on the slide that was initially a disability accommodation. And now you would be hard pressed if you stand on a busy street corner to find someone that doesn't default to using the curb cut, because it makes life more accessible and easier for everybody. So one of the things that we are challenged with in this work is getting past the perceptions and misperceptions. And in order to do that, in some cases, we really need to call them what they are. And a lot of times they are the symptoms of roots that are in norms and biases that we live with every day. Most people don't see themselves as having a bias, but the reality is we all do. Biases are the result of the way we see our world and the result from our unique experiences and beliefs. And in today's world, you would be really challenged to get through a day without encountering someone with a different set of beliefs and experiences. Sometimes bias can be implicit and subtle, and other times it's more blatant and overt. It's woven through our thinking, and research recently showed that 75% of the US population has implicit bias around disabilities. That means 3 out of the 4 people in our country have an ableist bias. In a long-term study, that's compounded by the findings that ableist bias, along with ageism, is the only area that we have not made significant inroads in our bias of our culture. In every other racial, geographic, sexual orientation, all of the other areas that we experience racism and bias, we have made great inroads, statistically speaking, except in these 2 areas where there was no significant difference in improvements on bias regarding ableism and ageism. So that said, we have our work cut out for us, because in addition to that, as a global social sector, ageism and ableism is also prevalent in service provision. So that's really woven through the foundation of lots of our industries, such as law enforcement, public policy, public health, healthcare. They all rely on some assumptions. Most of them follow what we refer to as the medical model, which is the view of disability, assuming that the disability is a deficiency or a problem within the person, and that trained personnel are the authorities to address the problem. We all know, I think, on this call, that model automatically creates a misperception of the person. it removes the person's power and value, and it removes responsibility from the society to remove those barriers. And so what we are aspiring for is addressing that implicit bias and perspective, particularly in the area of healthcare, but not exclusively in the area of healthcare as an example of what we need to do universally. But we do need to keep in mind these social assumptions as we pursue disability rights and disability justice. Want to be very clear about what we're saying when we say inclusion, rights, and justice, because they're often used interchangeably, but they're really not the same thing. Inclusion is the meaningful participation of people with disabilities. It's the development of disability-specific programs and equitable considerations for disability-related perspectives. Disability rights, on the other hand, refers to the rights of people with disabilities to be treated equally and with respect, and to participate in society on the same basis as others. There's a lot of laws around that we're all familiar with. Disability justice, on the other hand, can be described as a framework that examines disability and ableism and how they relate to other forms of oppression, such as race, class, and gender. Disability justice really lives in that intersectionality that Leanne was mentioning before. We've been talking about the impact of accessibility on our social and community systems in general. Let's talk about some of the specific findings that we can share with you and point to use direct actions that can improve safe and person-centered healthcare in particular. In a 2022-23 study of COVID-19 and people with non-apparent disabilities in healthcare settings, we worked with people with IDD and other non-apparent disabilities and with emergency personnel and other providers. They shared their perceptions and their lived experience from both groups of people, assessing and providing necessary supports. So two of the most significant findings in that project were that the shared understanding was not prevalent in providers. Providers did not have the knowledge or the skills to adequately address the needs of people with disabilities. Now, that probably doesn't come as any great revolutionary surprise to you. What did come as a little bit of a surprise in this project was their self-awareness, was the willingness in a safe space to acknowledge and to own that limitation. We also found that the gaps in service were the greatest related to non-apparent needs, such as trauma, mental health, and communication shortfalls. So regardless of the person's disability prior to the disaster, people with disabilities were left to try and address secondary and tertiary impacts related to invisible, non-apparent impact, including mental health. And they were left to try and address these needs outside of the core healthcare service delivery system. So there was no mechanism in place to address new and emerging non-apparent disabilities. This gap is where we often find the needs of people with IDD who are victims of sexual violence, especially in circumstances where there are other crises such as strained healthcare systems. This is not new, and I think it probably resonates with what each of you already know. But what was really important about this was it was tangible data that we were able to validate what we narratively and anecdotally know through the lived experience of the people we work with or our own experiences. The second project that I wanted to highlight is a long-term project with HHS, Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, where we piloted mixed expertise task forces in diverse jurisdictions to identify some of the social sector root causes for health disparities and generate some operational changes that can become systems change solutions. So we didn't just ask these local task forces, where are your challenges? We asked them to generate potential solutions that would be operational within their geographic area and within the systems that they were working. The discoveries we had included the challenges that providers and agencies had overcoming the core power dynamics between those who are, quote, representing a service or an industry and community members. There was a pervasive tendency to have a two-tiered system, even within these smaller task force groups that were intentionally mixed expertise, that were intentionally bringing in the voices of community members with disabilities. There was still a value placed on the different contributions of different task force members. So creating conversations where individuals with IDD and lived experiences are sufficient to impact change was one of the great takeaways. And that's not something that's easy to do. That's something that required us to be consistently revisiting that fundamental principle and priority, and be enforcing that the dialogue that's had in these opportunities must intentionally avoid implicit bias in order to facilitate equitable engagement and value the lived experience of individuals with disabilities in the same way and with the same weight that we value the lived experience of people who are coming from a professional perspective, from a service perspective. So that project really served to confirm again what we anecdotally know, what people experience on a daily basis. These studies, together with some feedback from additional focus groups of individuals with non-apparent disabilities, identified the innovation solutions of people with lived experience. So we wanted to say, what are some of the innovative ideas that people are bringing to the table? What are the solutions that can be pulled from the disability community and from people with IDD who have had relevant lived experiences? And what are the shortcomings of current healthcare providers and their trainings and strategies? We heard loud and clear in these focus groups that from previous providers and emergency responders, the quality or the importance of the content will always take a back seat to the realities of time constraints and personal limitations. So to address that, we created a 9 micro training series where the content was based on the experiences of patients with disabilities, most of whom had a non-disability related trauma, and took those micro trainings to represent a shared building effort of human experience together with AI tools. And that was our first venture into using AI tools to build up the advocacy for individuals with disabilities. The content of the training comes from the lived experience of individuals. The development of the training curriculum was done by an AI tool. And then we took that back to the community members and said, please review this. Is this true and accurate and reliable to what your solutions are? And so it was a circle of collaboration, both with individuals, with agencies and service providers, and with technology that started and ended with the affirming voice of the individuals with disabilities. The trainings for us became an example of how AI can be used in an ethical way. And the QR code that you saw on the screen is a link to those free trainings. They usually take about 7 minutes a piece, and they're free to anyone who's interested. Finally, I want to talk about AI and technology solutions, how we perceive them, and where the dangers and opportunities are as we pursue safe and equitable environments, because there are both dangers and opportunities. One of the challenges we have that we discovered is that most technology that's used within healthcare systems are not built for the patient in mind. They're built with the end user in mind, who is the provider or the provider's entity or the industry representatives. Many platforms are built with an emphasis on data management and tracking for internal systems functions, not an emphasis on how they engage with the human beings. So as a result, those may not be and often aren't reflecting the whole person. You get I think everyone has been on a form that you have to fill out, that the form selects the specific data points they want from you in order to create your profile, regardless of whether that really reflects who you are, what your needs are, or why you're on that platform in the first place. So being that they are made for the data collection, they are not made for the human beings. They don't allow for uniqueness and diversity, and they are not built to be accessible. One of the big challenges that we find in our user testing on and on and on is that what's built may be built, and then if someone thinks they want it to be accessible and want to include the disability community, they then come to someone like us to say, how do we fix this to make it accessible? When in reality, what we need to be doing is building accessibly, having platforms and products and tools that are born accessible rather than modified for partial accessibility. Examples of inaccessible components that are often overlooked in AI development are compatibility with screen readers, with fine motor mobility devices, content that's not in plain language, color contrast oblivion, and font choices, flash, pop-ups. All of those are pieces of accessibility that have to be part of the build in the first place. The other area of inaccessibility is the links that you often find, and the little secondary windows for particularly in healthcare and in service provision, where you have to go somewhere else to a full high-level reading document to understand your rights. So in terms of access technology and in terms of content, most of the things that we engage with on a daily basis that are built to represent AI are built inaccessibly. From the outset, this creates confusion and challenges for people with disabilities, and pretty much, I think it's safe to say, the vast majority of the users. People are usually expected to engage in or contribute to these tools that weren't built for them in mind. So from that initial build perspective, we are putting a gap between people with disabilities, people with IDD, and the opportunities to actually engage equitably with the technology. At the core of many of the disparities for AI technology in healthcare are some fundamental gaps, and I will go through them relatively quickly because I know I'm using up my time. But one of them is technology and apps have the ability to increase or decrease social, economic, and health disparities for people with disabilities, depending on how it's developed, how it's disseminated, and how it's used. All AI technology has to be built with and by individuals with disabilities in order to close the gap rather than widen it. And I'm going to take a very brief pause here to give you an example of how that can actually happen. The program that I mentioned, the Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration, which uses has an AI prototype for assisting disability-led organizations in a disaster. That prototype that we started with was built by an engineering team that was predominantly represented by people with disabilities. So they were there with their skills for building and developing AI technology, but they were doing it from the lived experience of being a person with a disability. And in many cases, those were people with intellectual and developmental disabilities of some fashion. Secondly, there's little to no user-friendly public-facing training that's available for people with IDD to effectively learn about AI and technology, learning how it can be used, and the potential dangers that have to be avoided. We have mentioned this throughout this conversation, and it's part of a lot of other conversations, but the bottom line is if we go out to find resources, training that is accessible and applicable for people with IDD on what is AI, How do you engage with technology safely? How do you differentiate and discern where there are potential dangers? That training can be difficult, if not impossible, to find because it doesn't generally exist. That's the same for other disabilities and the same for the aging population. Some of the level of discomfort, some of the fears that are evident in some of the research comes down to the lack of appropriate and applicable, useful and actionable training that can be used. So it's information. And finally, generative AI is not discerning or ethical. We like to talk about ethical AI, but AI as a characteristic is not ethical. It is only what we put into it. It is built to please the user, and it's subject to hallucinations, to autonomous decision making, unethical input bias, and unless development and maintenance is conducted with checks and balances throughout, and the input of subject matter experts with disabilities is a key component, the generative AI will not be ethical because of the way that it's fashioned. It can't be. It can't make the decision to be ethical on its own. We have to take that responsibility. So these overarching gaps have a common thread: the involvement of people with IDD in planning, implementation, use, and training on AI tools. This leaves people with IDD in an uncertain gray area. With many people, we've heard not sure where to get accurate information, how to contribute their advocacy and subject matter expertise to a new environment that is virtual rather than face-to-face. And for many people, especially people who have experienced violence or trauma, they don't have the resources or the tools to make this transition and to know when and how to trust machines and trust AI. This generates a lot of questions, most of which we don't have simple answers for, such as where is the information going and what is it being used for and will it be shared? Someone who asks those questions when given a tablet to put information in at a healthcare setting, they're not going to get the answers to that because the individual that they're talking to doesn't know either. How do I correct errors or problem solve? What accessibility accommodations can I receive? And is the information accurate? Is the information safe? And what are my rights? So there's been a lot of investment into the advocacy and rights for people with IDD in face-to-face engagement. What we need to do is take that investment and transition that into the virtual world of technology and AI. One of the things we know is that it would be a mistake to think that these questions are unique. In fact, we have recently found that in interactions with providers, we're learning over 80% of providers have relied on electronic resources for information. And in their practice, 63 have used AI tools for accommodations in the last 6 months. However, many of them are unclear about their actual use of data, may or may not know when they're engaging with AI, and may not be able to discriminate instances of when AI is contributing to their knowledge. So this is not a siloed challenge. This is a pervasive challenge, which is part of why I started with our whole society culture. For people with IDD and providers, we've heard they have similar responses to AI in healthcare, and those responses are mixed. On the negative side, 94% have significant potential concerns or risks of interacting with AI agents in healthcare workflows. Yet 34% found the biggest barrier to person-centered care is time constraints and staff knowledge, which could be addressed through AI. Many providers and individuals with disabilities have gaps in their understanding of AI and its role in their healthcare experience. Yet, many providers and individuals with disabilities have gaps in their understanding and its role in their healthcare experience. So those gaps can be filled. Concerns about trust with AI is not exclusive to any particular population group. Knowing this levels the playing field. And here's where I'm going to challenge you to be somewhat visionary. What if The focus on building the expertise was within the disability community. Could people with IDD take the lead in understanding, developing, and using AI in healthcare to create safe and effective strategies for person-centered care? What would it look like if we tried to develop that? If we designed AI tools expressly to support safe experiences, to provide necessary accommodations, to increase communication effectiveness, and to inform providers in areas where they don't have the experience or comfort, could we develop a mechanism that improved healthcare experiences and contributed to person-centered care without adding risk for people with disabilities? What we know absolutely is that people with disabilities have to be leading the decision making. There's an opportunity we have as a disability community that we need to step into. The environment of AI technology is changing at the speed of sound, which is a quote that I took yesterday from a meeting. It will look different in 18, 36, or 60 months. So we can't plan for now. We must plan for what is it going to look like 60 months from now. Fears and uncertainty will not change the process. The continuation of AI integration and the dependence of what we do on a daily basis on AI will continue to progress. It will, however, further leave people with disabilities behind if we allow it. The disability expertise will either be a part of the core decision making or it will be further excluded. Because we're not currently ahead of the curve, we're already behind. And the challenge that we have is to set our goals to include stepping into this need from positions and voices of leadership, rather than being intimidated by an industry or a concept that is so far unfamiliar. I wanted to share this quote in closing because we recently heard from a healthcare provider who has a person with who is a person with non-apparent disabilities, and talking about AI. And this is what they said, coming from both sides of the aisle on healthcare and disabilities. An inclusive AI healthcare ecosystem should prioritize functional assessment, longitudinal support, and real-world usability, not just optics or regulatory coverage. AI could help systematize needs assessments, track whether accommodations are effective, and flag when conditions are deteriorating due to inadequate support, rather than placing the burden of advocacy entirely on the disabled individuals. This message to me is very clear, and the opportunity is there. As we as a community can create our future relationship with AI and its role in healthcare settings, it's a tremendously large undertaking, but not greater than some of the undertakings that have been mastered by our predecessors. It's the challenge of taking on a new landscape and changing that landscape. We have to step forward into this because nothing should be without us. And this is the future of the culture we're going to be living in. So on that, I will pause or stop completely. And I don't believe I probably left much time, if any, for questions, which is probably safe on my part, but I'm sorry.
Dawn, thank you so much. This was such great information and so important, and such an area that we really need to pay attention to. I think your presentation was amazing. Thank you so much. What a great resource. You're right, though, we don't have time for questions. But with